This is the second in a series of exploring classic regions of Australia. The last session we did, we went to the Hunter Valley, to the Barossa Valley, and to Western Australia. This time we're going to go to Clare Valley, also South Australia, across to the Yarra Valley and to Langhorne Creek. Langhorne Creek, perhaps not so well known to many people, although it's a really well known and a very quite famous region. And I'll just quickly show you what it. There we are. There's my map of South Australia, and you'll see that you can see Adelaide there, and the famous regions, the Barossa Valley and so on. Langhorne Creek's this bit down here. That blue area is Lake Alexandrina, which is the mouth of the Murray River, and the part right next to it there is Langhorne Creek. So it's about 2 hours drive, more or less, from Adelaide. And one of the features of Langhorne Creek is that it's of the regions sort of near Adelaide. Langhorne Creek's a very cold place. That country there along that coastline is very flat and there's not much protection, so you get a lot of really cold wind off the Southern Ocean. And one of the features of Langhorne Creek wines is that it's actually quite a cold climate, and there's a lot of red grapes growing there. So all the red varieties ripen with a fair bit of acidity from the cold conditions. Anyway, that's wine number 3. We'll come back to that. I think because of our previous sessions, everybody has a good idea where Clare Valley and Yarra Valley are, and we will head for Clare Valley in a moment. Just again to elaborate on our theme, that we're dealing with classic regions in Australia. Grapes and varieties of vine are not all the same. They have different requirements, very similar to, let's say, fruit trees or something like that. So there are some fruit trees, tropical fruits, that like hot climates and grow in the north of Queensland. And then there are some fruit trees, such as, say, stone fruits or pears and apples, that like an inland cold climate. And it's the same with grape varieties. So one of the big things that I like to do is to look at the example of where the grape varieties grow in Europe, and particularly where the grape varieties have been growing for a long time, because it's a really good guide to the sort of conditions that are successful. So, for example, the Riesling has a home origin of Germany.
Everyone has their videos on.
All the best German vineyards are in a very northerly part of Germany. In fact, there's a sort of a very close tie between the world's wine region that's furthest from the equator, whether it's the German wine regions or Champagne. Germany's just a fraction further away. But the thing about the German wine regions is that they're on very steep slopes that are right next to the 2 big rivers. And so they get a lot of reflection of the low angle of the sun up into the vineyards, which is a similar story to what happens in Champagne, where the sunlight reflects off the chalky white soil, and it's a very bright sunlight, even though it's very cold. And so in Australia, Riesling grows very well in parts of Australia that are inland, higher altitude and cold. And that's the story with Riesling. So if someone says to you, I've got a lovely Riesling that grows in one of Australia's warmer areas, I think the chances of it being a great wine are pretty slim, because it just doesn't follow what are known to be the best characteristics. So our first wine is a Riesling. It's from It's from Clare Valley. Clare Valley is about an hour and a half or so, maybe towards an hour and 3/4 drive due north of Adelaide. So therefore, Clare Valley is about another 40 minutes or so further on from the Barossa Valley. Just a quick word about Riesling. It's there's a lot of Riesling grown in Australia. The average quality of Riesling is very good. Rieslings do really well in the wine shows. Rieslings are inexpensive though, and Riesling is not particularly popular other than in South Australia. South Australia drinks a lot of Riesling, and the other segment of the market that enjoys Riesling are older males. People like me seem to enjoy Riesling, but outside of those, out of either South Australia or old white males, Riesling's not popular. I think one of the reasons for it is that, Ken, I can see it. Ken's another pale older male. I won't go and use the critical critical label for us.
He's off to get another bottle.
Yes. One of the things about Riesling is that when it's young, it invariably has a high level of acidity, and that makes Riesling have this distinct, slightly sour character to a lot of tasters. The other thing about Riesling is that it is quite light-bodied. Now, to appreciate light-bodied wine and to look for quality, and many of you have done this before in previous sessions, one of the evaluation process to evaluate any wine actually is to have a sip and notice how long the flavour hangs around for after you've swallowed the wine, because some light-bodied wines linger on for a long time. So let's try, if you've got the Riesling or something similar, have a sip and swallow it. And I'll come back and talk about the flavour in a moment. But after you've swallowed the wine, you can taste it for a period afterwards. That wine there that I've got is just starting to fade away now. It's faded some seconds ago. I think it's got medium good persistence. It's not as long in the persistence as some Rieslings that I have seen. Some of them are amazing how you can taste them for quite a period of time afterwards. One of the things about wines of persistence is that if they've got good persistence, they really accompany food well. And also they're the wines that you find yourself coming back to. So if you had a single test on trying any wine put in front of you, and you can be distracted by maybe the label or the fame of the wine or the reputation or something like that, come back to the persistence test. It's a really good one. And one of the things about light-bodied wine is it can have great persistence. You expect a full-bodied, intense flavoured wine to have a big persistence, and in fact, intriguingly, quite a few of them don't. But it's lovely when you come up with a really light-bodied, quite delicate, easy-to-drink wine that has great persistence. And that is one of the great secrets of enjoying Riesling. To this wine that we do have now, this is from Watervale. Watervale is the southern part of the Clare Valley, and it is famous for making particularly steely Rieslings. If you go further north around Clare Valley Township, or a little bit to the eastern part of the Clare Valley, you come to Polish Hill River. And in both those regions, particularly Polish Hill River, the Rieslings are much more floral and a little bigger and richer and softer. And they're prettier Rieslings, whereas the Rieslings around Watervale come from the rockiest, stoniest part of the Clare Valley. And I'm not saying that that's a reason they have this steely flavour, but certainly it's part of the characteristic of that sub-region, and that's where this wine's from. So this wine, when you stick your nose in it, has a light lime juice. I mean, I find that Clare Valley Rieslings always have a little bit floral as well. You sometimes see flowers, but the lime juice characteristic, and usually that lime juice is very pure, and that's the characteristic of Clare Valley Rieslings. The other great area for Riesling in South Australia is Eden Valley, which is the hills east of the Barossa Valley. In that area, the Rieslings tend to be a lot more lemony, and they have a slightly broader tingling lemon taste, whereas this one is quite pure in the lime's aroma and the taste. So you can smell that, enjoy it, and you can taste that steeliness. And obviously the ideal role for a wine like that is to serve it chilled on hot days and for lunch or early parts of the evening meal with light foods. You know, we go with salads and avocados and seafood and prawns and light foods. That's very much the role of Riesling. It can be compared to Hunter Valley Semillon and other light-bodied wines. I find that the Italian white varieties, so we've tasted before Vermentino and Fiano, yes, and oysters, Ken, agreed. Vermentino and Fiano and other Italian white varieties, whether they're grown in Italy or Australia, also have a light-bodied lemony flavour, but there's something about the texture. You get a more interesting creamy texture from those Italian white varieties than with Riesling. Riesling has this steely purity, which makes it such an interesting wine and gives it such an interesting persistence. And if you can appreciate that and go looking for Rieslings, particularly say I would look for Clare Valley Rieslings, you can buy them for $13, $14, $15, up to $20. And it's not uncommon to find Clare Valley Rieslings that have won trophies and gold medals across the wine shows to be available for below 20. Certainly, if they're well known, they're perhaps climbing up into the $23, $24, $25 mark. It's very rare to find an Australian Riesling over $30. There are a couple. There's a famous producer in Clare Valley called Jeffrey Grosset, and his wines are more expensive. They're up in the sort of $33 to $35 territory, but that's considered expensive for Riesling. So for your repertoire of wines for a hot day and light foods, to have Riesling, you can do very well and very inexpensively. But going with that appreciation of Riesling is the requirement for that understanding and appreciation of light-bodied, steely, but nonetheless persistent white wine. And that's the story about Clare Valley Rieslings, and they're quite famous. There's another category, and this is another famous cliche, but there's another category of drinker of Riesling. I used to do quite a lot of wine show judging. I still do a little bit, but one of the common questions about wine show judges is people say, during the week of a wine show and you have dinner at night or something, what do off-duty wine judges drink? And even when the show's not on and you're just at home, what do you prefer to drink? What does a jaded palate wine judge, or for that matter, a jaded palate winemaker, what wines do they drink? And one of the wines that wine judges drink and winemakers drink is Riesling, absolutely, because it's the delicacy of it means that you can drink it easily. The good ones have got great persistence. And if you do have a jaded palate, there's a sort of a fineness and a delicacy about the wine that's so nice. The difficulty, of course, as I've already mentioned, is that to appreciate Riesling means that you do have to study that delicacy and that persistence to be able to get it. And if you don't do that and haven't figured that bit out, the Rieslings can just pass you by, and people can sort of, not get the Riesling thing. Yes, so Paul, after a few beers, and it's time for dinner, yes, we might drift into some wine and go back to Riesling or something like that. Yes, it is true to say that wine judges do drink a few beers at the end of a judging session, that's for sure. Just before we pass off Riesling, just a quick word about the origin of Riesling, namely in Germany, the two great areas being along the Rhine River, particularly that intriguing bend in the Rhine where the river runs most of its length in a north-south direction, but just south of Frankfurt, it does this little left-hand turn. I'm going downstream now, heading northwards. It does a left-hand turn to the west for a distance of about 30 or 40, 50 kilometers, and then it does another right-hand turn and heads north again into the North Sea, or the ocean. And in that intriguing reach of the Rhine River that is actually running east-west, in the later part of the day, when the sun's low and to the south, of course, because we're in the northern hemisphere, the Rhine River, the angle of the sun means it shines in on the slopes. And so those very cold areas still get enough sunshine to ripen the grapes. And so that interesting sort of reach of the Rhine River running east-west is just a lovely area that over the many centuries was found to be able to ripen grapes easily, whereas in the other directions of the river nearby, that wasn't the case. The vine was actually brought to that part of Germany by the Romans. In the ancient Romans came there, and that's when the vine was planted, and it's been there ever since. So the really famous regions of the Rheingau are where Riesling has its home, and some of the villages there are not unknown in Australia. There's the eastern part of that reach is a little village area called Hockheimer, and the English wine trade shortened that to Hock. Now it's spelled H-O-C-H, Heimer, but the English just spelt it H-O-C-K, as in Hock. And if you're my age or older, you remember that until it was banned, Australians used to produce light white wine and call it Hock, H-O-K or H-O-C-K. And it was just one of those names that floated around. The other area that's also famous for Riesling is a river that flows into the Rhine just near the Rheingau, which is the Mosel River. And that's another name that in Australia for a time there, we used to rip that name off and put it onto a fruity white wine that was made up of any old grapes that the winemaker could put his or her hands on. But normally it was a bit fruity because those German Rieslings, whether they're from the Mosel or the Rheingau, often the grapes don't go through to complete ripeness. And when the wine's made, there's quite a lot of acidity in it. So the Germans deliberately make the wine just a little bit sweet to balance that acidity. And so a lot of German wine is ever so slightly sweet. Some of them are quite sweet, which has sort of given a lot of German Riesling a bad name. A lot of you would recall a wine called Liebfraumilch, and there were brands such as Blue Nun, which gave German wine a bad name, and which is a shame because German Riesling is a glorious wine and has that same delicacy. It's definitely birds of a feather with Australian Riesling, although German Rieslings are a little bit more floral and they do have that ever so slight fruitiness, sweetness on them, particularly from the Mosel. So there, again, in Australia, you can buy German Rieslings and they're not that expensive. The reasonably basic ones. If you get the best estates from Germany, they can be very expensive. So there we are. There's Riesling. Riesling's been made in Clare Valley since the 1850s. There's a lot of knowledge about Riesling there and in Eden Valley. So that's why Clare Valley Riesling rates as one of Australia's classic wines and classic areas, because there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of history in the making of the wine. And it's no flash in the pan. And that's our theme for what makes an Australian classic region. It's a great variety growing in a particular area that's got a great track record for producing high quality. Let's move on. Before we do, anybody got a question about Riesling or Clare Valley or Germany or anything like that?
Yeah, Andrew, I'm just curious about what in Germany, what they are allowed to add in, because of course the laws are different in every country. What are their national requirements legally?
Okay, so as with anywhere in Europe, they're allowed to add sweetness, and they can add that before the fermentation or during the fermentation. So if they have grapes that haven't ripened sufficiently, meaning the grapes don't have enough natural sugar of their own, they can add it. In Germany, the highest level, which is the QMP level, they're not allowed to add cane sugar, that is sugar out of bags. What they can do is they can actually add intensified grape juice or grape pulp of the same grapes from the same region. And that's how they can boost the sweetness level up to make the fermentation proceed. And there's a few rules like that, but that's what they're allowed to do. Similarly to any other area of the world, when you start playing with additives, if you do more than just a little adjustment, you get a wine out of balance and you can taste it too easily. So Germany, for some years now, because I guess it's a global warming phenomenon, has been through vintage after vintage where they haven't had to add any sweetness in a lot of these classic areas. They call it Swiss Reserve, by the way, the unfermented grape juice of the same vintage in the same area. And Germany's now making this marketing approach to Europe and the UK, where German wines are being marketed that don't have additive and are actually dry. So they don't need the sweetness to give them balance, because Germany's had these warmer vintages and getting quite ripe Riesling. So I've seen these Rheingau Rieslings that are around about 12% alcohol, which was unheard of in years gone by, when German Rieslings were always about 8, 9, 10, 11%, because that was the amount of ripeness that they could achieve in such a cold place. But they're getting these warmer vintages. So what you just asked, David, about additives is there's a tradition that goes back centuries, but it's suddenly being changed just in recent years. Okay, let's move from South Australia to Victoria, to the Yarra Valley. Now, Yarra Valley starts at Healesville, which is effectively the outer suburbs of northeast Melbourne. It's on a train line. People commute readily from the Yarra Valley into central Melbourne to work. And the Yarra Valley has an interesting history in that it was settled with grapes back in the 1840s and 50s. In fact, the famous name there was Castella, who was an ancestor of that famous Australian marathon runner that popped up in the Olympics years ago. And the wine that the Yarra Valley made was high quality and delicate. They were making whites and reds. The wines were extremely popular for a while in the 1870s and 1880s and into the 1890s in England. And the Yarra Valley did very well at that time. In the 1890s, there was a worldwide economic downturn, and there were bank crashes and bank busts all over the world, including in Australia. And a lot of world trade stopped, and the appetite for delicate wines just dried up, and the traditional demand in England resumed, which was for Australian wine of very high alcoholic strength, preferably fortified a bit, that is port and muscat styles. And the Yarra Valley suddenly found that it couldn't sell its wine anymore to England. And because of the bank bust and the disappearing of interest in the more delicate wines, the Yarra Valley found it couldn't sell its wines much in Australia either. So much of the Yarra Valley was abandoned in the 1890s, and the Yarra Valley became mainly a sheep district. It was never much of a market garden area because it's a little too arid and it's too cold anyway. The Yarra Valley is actually quite a cold place. And it was only in the 1970s and mainly in the 1980s when Australia had the wine boom reignite, the one that had existed in the 1880s and 1890s, that pioneers restarted the Yarra Valley. And there were some pretty famous names that went in there. Just like the Margaret River story, a lot of them were doctors who had this interest, and they planted or replanted these original vineyard sites, and Seville Estate and the Yeringberg, Yarra Yering, all these once famous properties in the 1800s were all replanted and started producing wine. And the wealthy consumers of Melbourne were well and truly ready for it. And a little bit like so much of the Hunter Valley produce goes to the Sydney market, in this boom in the 1980s, much of the Yarra Valley produce went to the Melbourne market, and the Yarra Valley wines became the darlings of the sommeliers and the Melbourne restaurant scene. Now, Victoria had its huge, big liberalising of its licensing laws in the 1980s and 1990s, where restaurants were able to sell wine to people who weren't diners. And restaurants could have a wine bar in the front of the restaurant just serving drinks, and you didn't have to be a bona fide diner. And that kind of liberalising has come into lots of other states of Australia now, and including Queensland. But back at the time, unless you were a bona fide diner in a restaurant, you couldn't order a drink in many parts of Australia. So wine, particularly from the Yarra Valley, boomed in Melbourne. Other parts of Victoria with boutique wines also boomed. So there was East Gippsland, where a number of producers, small producers, had also recommenced, and the most famous one there was Bass Phillip with the Pinot Noirs. And then there was also the Geelong and the Macedon regions, and all of them had very famous vineyards and wineries in the 1880s and 1890s. So there was this rediscovery. But I guess the Yarra Valley, being the closest to Melbourne, made it particularly popular. But the other thing the Yarra Valley had going for it was that Australia's most prominent wine writer of the time, who was a lawyer living in Sydney, James Halliday, was transferred by his firm, Clayton Newts, to live in Melbourne, and he decided to establish a winery in the Yarra Valley, live there and commute into Melbourne. And at the time, he was, and still is actually, writing the wine column in the Weekend Australian, which is probably the most widely circulated wine column that you could read. And to this day is, still read by people who get the Weekend Australian. And James Halliday, to say that he gave the wine regions around Melbourne, which he dubbed them the Melbourne Dress Circle, because they're a circle round. There's the Mornington Peninsula, Gippsland, Yarra Valley, Macedon, and Geelong, right round Melbourne. And he dubbed them the Melbourne Dress Circle. To say that he gave them a flogging in his wine column is an understatement, because he really became a very strong voice for introducing all Australians to these boutique wines from these regions around Melbourne. To a certain extent, the big companies never really got in. De Bortoli is a bit of an exception, and they own a lot of the Yarra Valley now. But at the time, it was mainly small entrepreneurial enthusiasts doing a boutique winery. The two grapes that initially they were interested in, because that's what had been grown back in the 1880s and 1890s, were Cabernet Sauvignon. And Cabernet from the Yarra Valley is a very pretty, delicate, very lovely red wine, in my opinion. Sort of closer to Coonawarra, which we talked about last time. That is an aromatic, lighter-bodied, very interesting Cabernet. But much lower in alcohol and body than other parts of South Australia. But of course, Cabernet Sauvignon was a pretty crowded market, and it wasn't long before Yarra Valley boutique producers, and particularly Mornington Peninsula as well, started going into Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And of course, that happened to just coincide with the great wave of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir from boutique producers in Australia in the 1980s and 1990s. And I guess you'd say the Yarra Valleys never looked back. And if you didn't realise the story about Cabernet Sauvignon, you'd think that when you look at the shelves in an upmarket wine shop looking at Yarra Valley wines, you pretty much only see Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. You'd think that that's all the Yarra Valley ever did, which is actually not the case. Having said that, it does it pretty well. So to our Yarra Valley Pinot Noir, and the Yarra Valley makes Pinot Noirs that vary. They are never that big in their body or size. They're normally the lighter, more elegant style, and they can often be have a light sort of complex earthiness about them. But to this wine, you'll see the pale colour, so it's obviously one of the light varieties. And same as with the Riesling, pass by the aroma and so on and go straight to the sip and the persistence test. And you can also feel the shape of the wine. It's got that silky mid-palate, typical of Pinot Noir. I can taste it quite firmly now. It's just starting to fade a little bit now. And when it starts to fade, it fades away quite quickly. So I'd put that in the middling quality area. It's pretty good, but it's it's obviously a Pinot Noir made to a price. Some of the Yarra Valley Pinot Noirs, of course, they're quite expensive. We're talking $60, $70, $80, $90 a bottle for some of the famous Yarra Valley Pinot Noirs. Can have quite a rich, silky palate and a fantastic persistence. Back to the aroma, and you see that red, sweet cherry, red cherries and a little bit of the strawberry liqueur aroma, which are all classic aromas of Pinot Noir, followed by that velvety, there's a velvety mid-palate feel about Pinot. And Pinots, as a grape variety, have a little bit of acidity. That's what's giving you that slightly sour maraschino cherry finish, which Pinot does as a grape variety particularly well. Now, for a red wine of that colour and with an aroma of a red cherry, we could be saying that there are other contenders for wines like that. So there's some Barbera and Grenache and some Italian varieties, Nero d'Avola and Aglianico and various things. And some of them can certainly, particularly Barbera, can certainly have a red and black cherry aroma, and you can be fooled just on the aroma of the wine into thinking you may have Pinot Noir. What Pinot's got is that level of acidity, which is there, giving you a slightly sour finish acidity. And a lot of Pinot Noir producers, to give a bit of complexity, also put whole bunches in the fermentation. So you get the stalks of the bunches of the grapes, which will add to that tart sort of edginess to the flavour of the Pinot. But the big thing about Pinot Noirs that is not done by Grenache and Barbera and the others is that silky velvet mid-palate. And you can test that out for yourself one day by getting with a group of friends and open up some Barbera and Italian Reds and a Pinot and just jumble them up. And you can even block your nose and taste them, and you can taste the feel and the shape of Pinot Noir. Now, Pinot Noir having good persistence means it goes well with food. The foods for Pinot Noir are pretty varied really, and antipastos and light dishes, right through to light meats and so on. The classic combination was always duck and light game dishes with Burgundy, which is the red grape of Burgundy is Pinot Noir, and that was always the characteristic. But I mean, I could think of all sorts of combinations of lasagna and roast roast chicken and poultry and a whole wide range would go really well with Pinot. It's a fabulous food accompaniment, and it's very flexible with a range of foods. The thing about Pinot is it's very drinkable. The light lifted aroma is popular. The silky mid palate is popular. And people who are not that much into wine, but just, would like to have something nice, certainly enjoy Pinot Noir if you put it in front of them. The downside of that is the fact that Pinot Noirs are so expensive. Pinot Noir is a difficult red grape to grow, and it's a very difficult grape to turn into good wine. And it's a Pinot Noir is the grape variety that is not really made by the big corporate producers. So, you don't find readily available a Penfolds Pinot. Penfolds actually do make an experimental Pinot Noir, which they sell it all. But in the mainstream range of Penfolds or Wolf Blass or Australia's big companies, you don't find Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is the purvey of small boutique hands-on producers, and it's best made in small batches, and all over the world that's the case with Pinot Noir. And so, of course, there's no economy of scale, and so with so much input expense, Pinot Noirs tend to be expensive, unfortunately. So to sort of get to the first base of Pinot Noir in Australia, quite unlike Riesling, you've generally got to go and spend around about the $40, $45 mark just to get started. And it doesn't take long before Pinot Noirs climb to the $50 and $60 a bottle, let alone the reserve and famous ones, which are even more expensive again. And that's the story on Pinot Noir. But people get hooked on it, and Pinot tragics, they call themselves, or Pinophiles, or whatever the names are, and they're resigned to the fact that it's an expensive hobby. Yeah, yes, Laura, like champagne. Once you've got a taste for it, it's an expensive hobby. Anybody got a question about the Yarra Valley or Pinot Noir in general, or anything to do with that?
Hey, Andrew. The owner of Wine Experience mentioned to me when I was buying it about the actual winemaker being associated with another winery that was actually, let's say, the next notch up in terms of wines that he made.
Yeah, so I don't know too much about the detail of that. That sort of thing does happen. If you go looking for,
I think it was Paul Bridgman was the winemaker.
Yes, I don't know much about him.
And Levantine Hill.
Yeah, Levantine. He's the winemaker there. Levantine Hill is a very large producer. It's where Levantine Hill actually took over a large old vineyard complex, and they built this state-of-the-art cellar door winery function centre complex, and they got very large vineyards. And I would say that this particular wine we have here is probably a brand that belongs to the winemaker, who's probably an employee, but he's got a deal with his employer and owner whereby he can make a batch of wine on the side, maybe from grapes that come in which would otherwise go into the Levantine Hill brand. And quite a lot of that goes on. If you've got a really good winemaker, they're often very entrepreneurial, and as well as making your wine and putting your label on it, and and doing that on a contract position or a salaried position, a lot of winemakers do like to make a small batch of wine with their own label and do it on the side, and that happens a fair bit. And I think that would probably be the story here without knowing much more about it. It's obviously also a Pinot Noir for a budget. It's an affordable Pinot Noir. The Levantine Hill one you mentioned is pretty expensive, and is one of the sort of very big trophy Pinot Noirs that you'd find in the Yarra Valley. Any other questions about
Andrew, there was a question there just about age of vines. Did the phylloxera virus go through the Yarra Valley, or was
Yeah.
that around Geelong?
No, Yarra, the phylloxera, when it got in, which was sort of, by the 1890s, I suppose, or the 1880s, it had really much got to so much of country Victoria. Now, it got in initially in parts of Victoria in about the 1860s, 70s, and phylloxera is a sorry, yes, Kenya, it's not a virus. The phylloxera is an insect. It's a pest, and
sorry, Ken, I'm fixated.
Yeah, and what they didn't know what to do with it, of course, and so quite a few Victorian regions, they abandoned the area and they moved further north, trying to get away from phylloxera, and the phylloxera moved northwards with them. It turned out that the phylloxera mite travels underground, and it needs to travel in black or clay soil, and it sort of literally travels in the voids and the cracks that form in the dry weather in the black soil. So if you've planted grapes on sandy soil, you tend to have a bit of protection against phylloxera. It does travel through the air as well, so that was a nuisance. But the famous story of Tabilk, which is at Nagambie in central Victoria, is that area there is a very sandy area, and the phylloxera didn't get into the that Nagambie area, and so Tabilk still have original Shiraz vines that came from the Rhone Valley in France in the 1840s and the 1850s. Now, phylloxera got into France pretty heavily, and it decimated the Rhone Valley. And so one of the great stories that pops up every now and then is where there's a visit by Rhone Valley estate producers to Tabilk by arrangement, and they actually take cuttings of Tabilk vines back to the Rhone Valley to propagate them, because it's the original stock on its own root stock. It's on the original Shiraz roots that came out from France, whereas in the Rhone Valley now, all of the Shiraz vines have been planted on the American rootstock, which is resistant to the phylloxera. So it's one of those interesting stories. But phylloxera was certainly made a big mess of much of Victoria, and including the Yarra Valley. And I mean, by the sort of 1890s, they knew to plant on the resistant rootstock, but to do that, you needed money. And of course, because of what I mentioned earlier on, where the Yarra Valley wines had gone out of fashion, a lot of the producers just didn't have the money to do it, and they couldn't sell the wine anyhow. So the whole area sort of lapsed until it was reinvigorated. Now we want to move on to Langhorne Creek, a lesser known, little known area of South Australia, but you do get Langhorne Creek wines, and you do get blends of South Australian wine with Langhorne Creek as a component. Langhorne Creek, very a lot of history, planted very early in the 1800s. I guess it really came to fame from being a very rustic sort of area when Wolf-Blass discovered it. Now, Wolf-Blass was a German winemaker brought to Australia to do contract winemaking, because in the 1960s, the Germans had patented a stainless steel tank fermentation method that allowed fermentation of white grapes under pressure, and then the filtration of that sparkling wine into bottle, all done in very clean stainless steel tank circumstances. And in the 1960s, Australia had a bit of a taste for that light, fruity, sparkling wine. And we had wines like Star Wine, and there was a red variant around called Kaiserstuhl Cold Duck. I mean, you have to be as old as me, or especially Ken, to remember wines like that, which no one else watching is that old, so you won't know. But if you ask your parents, they'd probably remember about these Australian wines with these odd names. Yeah, Star Wine was one. And
was Black Tower a part of that crowd?
What was that?
Black Tower.
Oh yes, Black Tower was another one. Yeah. So Wolf Blast was brought out from Germany because he knew about this this system of making that kind of wine, and he did a period of contract winemaking in Barossa Valley before he departed, and he branched out on his own, and he became a contract winemaker for hire. And he used to travel all over South Australia, looking at vineyards and making decisions about grapes and picking and blending and all that sort of stuff. And he became this wonderful blender where he would blend batches of grapes from different regions in South Australia to make these wines. All red wines for him at the time. It didn't take him long before he actually started putting out wine with his own label. And at the time, he didn't have premises. He was actually making the wines at a number of different wineries that he was the contract winemaker for. But early on, he saw that there was an elegance in the blend if you use Langhorne Creek grapes. And he used Langhorne Creek Cabernet and Shiraz pretty extensively, along with his Barossa Valley, and he also used Clare Valley and Coonawarra grapes as well, and a lot of Eden Valley. And he used to make up these Cabernet Shiraz blends, and he had the Wolf Blast Black Label and the Wolf Blast Grey Label. And he started entering them in wine shows and very quickly did really, really well. And he won this famous Jimmy Watson Trophy years running at the Melbourne Wine Show when he was still just a young contract winemaker with his own brand, and people clamoured to buy his wine then, so he quickly got premises and never looked back. But he used Langhorne Creek grapes extensively, and he had big grower contracts with the growers there. And to this day, there's quite a lot of grower contract going on with Langhorne Creek grapes being supplied to famous producers. And to this day, Wolf Blast, but also Penfolds and others have Langhorne Creek components in their wines. There's also the producers that produce a straight estate wine from Langhorne Creek. And we tonight have got Bleasdale, which is one of the very historic producers that's been in the Langhorne Creek region for a long time, and you can read about them on the fine print of the rear label. And we have a 2018 Shiraz here, and it's a wine that's been made by Bleasdale for over a century, I guess. To the taste, first of all, to the persistence, to the style and persistence. Now, bearing in mind it's Shiraz, notice that it's got a creamy, velvety texture, not unlike Pinot Noir, not the same though. And it's a bit more full-bodied and a bit bigger. Quite elegant, very silky for a 2018 red. And it's just fading now, so it's got some pretty good persistence. And that's the first thing you can say. So I think it's reasonably high quality. The other thing that you'll notice about it, but now we're talking South Australian Shiraz. So just picture the last bottle of South Australian Shiraz that you had from, say, the Barossa Valley or McLaren Vale or somewhere. And when you go back and look at the aroma, it's got quite an interesting sweet but maraschino cherry, almost like an Italian red aroma. And then that palate, as well as that creaminess, notice that tart acidity. Think of where someone squeezed a lemon or fresh lemon juice into your red wine, and there's a degree of that sour tartness. And on the persistence, that is the remnant taste that it leaves in your mouth, that slightly sour acidity is certainly a strong part of the taste. And of course, that's the product of cold climate grape growing. You don't get that savoury acidity in warmer parts where you grow grapes, like the Barossa Valley, which is particularly warm, or certainly McLaren Vale is not as warm as the Barossa Valley, but it's a fair bit warmer than Langhorne Creek. Yes, so Bleasdale make the sparkling Shiraz, Amy, yeah, they're the same brand. And again, sparkling wine has to go through quite a lot of winemaking process. And if the wine has natural acidity, it's a great protector of the wine going through that winemaking process. So Langhorne Creek grapes to go into a sparkling red would be a really good thing. Certainly Bleasdale's been making the sparkling red for a long time. So you can see here that we're dealing in a young Shiraz, but it's a very elegant, slightly savoury, sour, almost Italian red style Australian Shiraz. There's almost a green tea leaf aroma to that red cherry. It's quite an intriguing Italian red wine aroma on it. And all these descriptors are the fact that Shiraz was grown in a pretty cold place and is giving you that savoury cold climate style of Shiraz flavour, which is not to a lot of people's taste. If you've grown up getting to know South Australian reds, particularly big oaky reds from the Barossa Valley, they're quite different to this. Barossa Valley reds have, if they've got the American oak, they've got a very strong, rich, chocolatey, coconutty aroma. They have a bigger, rounded, but more liqueur-y taste. And the aroma of very ripe Barossa Shiraz is more figs and fig jam and conserve, you know, the raspberry jam that you spread on your toast sort of thing. Whereas this is very much in that savoury cherry and that very, there's a touch of that sour acidity on the palate. And that's Langhorne Creek for you. Very, very interesting area. It's a very low-lying flat area, and in times of flood, which I guess doesn't happen that much these days, there's all those battles about how much water should be going down the Murray, but in times of flood, Langhorne Creek naturally floods, and they say that Langhorne Creek gets enough water in the soil in a flood to last it for about a decade. And that was always traditionally one of the areas, one of the things that happened in Langhorne Creek. And so they didn't need to irrigate because the area itself had the reserves of water down in the soil underneath from the flood irrigation that used to take place. But very interesting, very traditional area, interesting place to visit. You can sort of go down that coast from Adelaide past McLaren Vale to Victor Harbour and the Fleurieu Peninsula, and then keep on going to Langhorne Creek. Anybody got a question about that or our classic regions tonight?
Andrew, I would just say, I was just saying to Todd before that maybe a year or two ago, I would never have picked up a red wine, like at all. I could not drink red wine. And it's interesting now, I'm finding myself tonight, probably I would pick the Pinot Noir and the Shiraz over the Riesling. So yeah,
Oh, that's interesting.
it's interesting. Yeah, no, I'm definitely enjoying more of those lighter reds. I'm still not at a Cab Sauv or a Cab Merlot, but Pinot Noir and a Shiraz, I'm definitely enjoying.
Yeah, that's good. I opened a Cabernet last night, which was a Parker Estate from Coonawarra, and it was in 2016, which was a pretty cold year there. So not unlike this Bleasdale wine now. And I thought it was lovely, a very aromatic, very perfumed Cabernet, but quite light body, very elegant, and it had a lot of acidity on it, which does happen in Coonawarra. And I think that would be a Cabernet Sauvignon that would fall in line with this Bleasdale. As distinct from a lot of Cabernet that you can find, say Margaret River Cabernet, which is a lot bigger and a lot more oak, which makes a bigger, more powerful oaky style, which is probably what you wouldn't like. But you can get Cabernet that, I think maybe try out the odd Coonawarra Cabernet when you see them. And, you can be very pleasantly surprised. I think that's one of the good things about Coonawarra. It makes an aromatic, more delicate style of Cabernet, which is not to a lot of mainstream consumers' preferences, but I think it's great.
The other night before we went into lockdown, we went to a local Italian restaurant with some friends, and we actually ordered a Montepulciano. And that after the last session that we did, and that was beautiful. And then when we went into lockdown, I went to Dan Murphy's and got a whole heap of Chianti. So definitely brushing up on my red wine.
I must say your Zooms have been great because it was good. Yeah, we went to this Italian restaurant. We went, Montepulciano. Oh, we did that last week on Andrew's Zoom.
There we go. Yeah, well, those reds you're describing are all that lighter, more savoury style red.
Yeah.
Everything you're describing is in that vein, which is very much obviously a style that you like. I personally like that style too. I'm not that good on, the big alcoholic, well-ripened, very oaky style reds, but they're certainly popular in the marketplace. And it's to my taste, they're, I can see and I can appreciate the quality, but it's not what I choose to drink. I prefer the more savoury, light-bodied reds. I do like Pinot Noir. There's no question about that, and Italian reds. But I like this Bleasdale. I like these savoury styles myself. So yeah, it's good. How are you finding them, Paul? You got the same wines as us there tonight as what we're talking about?
Yeah, we got the same three. Jo loves the Riesling, as always. She's a white drinker and probably not as far advanced as Amy. But the Pinot is definitely my pick. I think, and probably also because we're not eating dinner or anything like that. I think the Shiraz would probably be a really nice end of meal type drink for me. But again, that's just about time. But
yes,
I don't know how these wine tasters do these shows, and I don't know what time they drink them at, but I need good food.
No, I think you're right. Especially with acidity, often you need the food with it because it can be a bit tough on the digestive system if you're drinking acidic wine and not having something to eat. Ken mentioned much earlier on about how the acid in wine or in any beverage for that matter makes you drool a bit. It makes your mouth, water because of an anticipation of the food. There's something about high acid drinks being aperitifs. They're getting you ready to eat food, and so if you're drinking these high acid savoury styles and you don't eat something, you can notice it pretty quickly. So I agree, Paul, about that. We've got other classic regions of Australia we're going to do in future weeks. We also have a lockdown theme, which is by request from Frederick and Hannelore. So although for a while I thought maybe in Queensland we'd all be getting it as well, but and the Melbourneites might be interested. So the theme, which we will do a series, but the theme is to find wines that are particularly expressive of the area that the grapes are grown. And even though you're locked down at home, wherever you are, you can put a picture on your screen of the far off wine region and look at that picture and look at the map of the region and imagine you're there and sip this wine that has this definite flavour of where it's from. And in itself, that's a very interesting theme. There's a lot of debate about that. Some of you have probably read in recent days, there's been a fair bit of media about the new releases of Penfolds Reds, including the latest release of Grange and other very expensive Penfolds wines. And when you read the background, the Penfolds Reds are blended across basically all the regions of South Australia. And this year's Grange is unusual in that it's just Shiraz. Most Granges have a bit of Cabernet in them, and so they're not all Shiraz. And of course, the thing about Penfolds are not rushing to admit this, but the thing about Penfolds is that the Penfolds wines are made to a style. The wines have a Penfolds taste, and that's what they do. And when you taste a Penfolds wine, you pretty much know that it's a Penfolds red. If you asked where it's from, well, if you're somebody who follows all the vintages and can remember all that stuff, well, you'd know that from memory, but it's not something that you taste. So the big thing is to have wines that taste to their region. And you can get Barossa Valley reds that have a really distinctive taste to the Barossa Valley. In these sorts of quests for these wines, I'm after, I guess, estate wines. That is wines 100% from a particular vineyard that's in the estate that's from a particular region. And I think we're certainly got wines that do that really well in Australia. Europe's probably got there before us. Europe has been obviously making wine of distinction for many centuries, and what stood those regions in good position is the fact that they have a very distinctive taste. And when you taste good wines of European regions, you pretty much know straight away where you are because the wine has such a distinctive taste. In Australia, it hasn't been quite the same. It's starting to evolve that way. Anyway, you'll see that when we get to that tasting, I've picked some wines that I think give us some pretty interesting flavour. And then we've got another theme then, which is to taste wines from regions on the Great Dividing Range, but they're lesser known areas. So I'm going to explore that. We'll do Orange and Cowra and Mudgee and various other interesting places. So keep an eye out for those. So we've got the next 2 Sunday nights we'll be tasting, and I feel that, and the feedback I'm getting is that to continue the classic regions of Australia and explain a bit about their history and why they're classic is a good thing to do, and to keep the theme going of more wines for lockdown, even if we're not locked down. And so we'll do those with themes in September. And as always, if you have suggestions about any of that, or commentary that you'd like me to Laura and I to consider and take on board, please drop us an email and go and do the likes on Facebook and all that sort of stuff, so that we have our popularity is always much appreciated.
Andrew?
Yes, hi Ken.
I shall have to tell you what we're having for dinner tonight.
And we need a wine of the week from you as well.
Well, we're going to have a Shiraz tonight because this will bring back a warm glow of fond recollection for you. We're having a piece of eye fillet from a specially selected Brangus beast that was fed on the grass of a place you know well. Yalbaroo.
Yalbaroo. How about that? North of Mackay.
Yes. Yeah. That, folks, is where Andrew was in charge of the roadworks back in 1983. When we
I remember Yalbaroo.
And he used to come, that's how we met.
That's a wonderful section of the Bruce Highway there.
Play golf.
What do you say, Andrew?
Oh, well, I'm sure that beef will taste spectacularly good.
It will. It will. Yeah.
Have you got the right Shiraz to put with it?
Oh, we've got a choice of one or two. I thought we might try the Z wines from
Bleasdale. They're good. They're interesting wines.
Yeah.
They're mostly McLaren Vale, and they got good varietal character across the Z range, and they're a good vintage sellers and Dan Murphy sort of fighting brand. We
might give it
And okay. I might try and sit in on the wine tasting when you do the South Burnett, because I believe I've just been through that area.
Yeah.
Is that around the Bunya Mountains?
Yes, that is. So that's the area we're waiting to see some wine from there. So that's that Merg and Kingaroy area.
Yeah.
Which is it's another Queensland region and much smaller than the Granapel. But
well, I went past the entrance for a winery called Rangemore, I think it was. Just as I was setting off up the road into the Bunya Mountains, which is possibly the most evil road I've ever seen in my entire life. Worse than anything in Scotland. Yeah. And I don't think my heart rate got back to normal for quite some time. The Devil's Elbow should have been a little bit of a giveaway.
No, it sounds a bit forbidding to be exploring that part
And
of
the
the
other
world.
side was much nicer, going to Kingaroy.
Now, Kingaroy and Mergen are nice towns, and it's a nice.
Well, wine of the week. Well, it has to be a Riesling. And in pursuance of the objective of trying to recommend things that people can actually obtain and buy now, a couple of 2020 Rieslings, a pair, depending on what you can get yourselves.
Yep.
The Peggy's Hill, the poor place that burnt down. What was that place called, Andrew?
Which brand?
Henschke, Peggy's Hill.
Oh, yeah, Peggy's.
The 2020 Henschke's Peggy's Hill is delightful. And to go back to the Clare, Petaluma, Hanlin Hill. The 2020 Petaluma Hanlin Hill.
Just happens to have one to hand there, Frederick.
Has he?
All right.
Do we agree on that then?
No, I agree. No, it's one of the classic Clare Rieslings. The Petaluma Hanlin Hill. I agree about that. Yeah. Righto, thanks, folks. Well, that's great. Hope you enjoy that tonight. Obviously, these wines will keep for the next few days if you put the caps on and put them in the fridge. If you want to enjoy them tomorrow night and the night after, drop us some emails and things, and we'll catch up next Sunday afternoon and chat in at about 10 to 5 and chat down. Look forward to seeing everybody then and trying some more wine. So, good night, all.
Great, thank you.
See you.
See you all.
Good night.